Hello, everybody. My name is Joel Andreas. I'm a professor in the sociology department at Johns Hopkins University. I've been here since 2003 when I graduated from UCLA. It's a wonderful place to work. I really enjoy teaching at Hopkins. And I'd like to thank everybody. Today I do my research on China, exclusively on China. I study the period from 1949 to the present. I focus mainly on the Mao era. I'm interested in social inequality and political contention. And although I focus on the Mao era, I also bring my research up to the present day. I'm interested in education, inequality and political contention in the fields of education, industrial relations, as well as in agriculture and rural China. Today, I'm going to be talking about my recently published book, came out in the fall of last year, Disenfranchised, the Rise and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China. The book covers the tumultuous changes in industrial relations in Chinese factories since 1949 to the present. I'd like to thank for organizing this talk today, all the folks at Hopkins at Home. This is a great initiative, including Vicki and Stephen and Renee and Hiro. I'd like to welcome all of you, and I certainly welcome your questions. Feel free to put in your questions throughout the presentation, and I'll try to answer as many as I can after the presentation at the end. First, I'd like to put this talk into a global context and a historical context. I was teaching at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology last semester in the fall, visiting there. And I was teaching a class about China, and we were talking about how people during the first decades after the 1949 revolution, workers had relatively long-term job tenure in Chinese factories. And a French exchange student piped up and she said, well, that was true in France as well. Workers in France also during that period also had long-term job tenure. And that's absolutely true. This was a global phenomenon in many different countries, what I call the global era of industrial citizenship. It extended more or less from the Second World War through the 1980s. And during this period, workers enjoyed extensive influence inside factories. This was based on long-term job tenure. Workers were considered legitimate stakeholders. They had a right to their jobs, and they were not simply considered to be hired hands. Workers were also highly organized through unions and work councils. Some of these unions and work councils were more autonomous than others. Some were organized directly and initiated by the workers. Others were organized by management or the state. But they all provided some kind of venue for participation. This was also an era when the slogan industrial democracy was in vogue. It was never fully realized anywhere, of course, but it often meant during this period, because of the conditions that I just mentioned, workers often had substantial power. These ideas of industrial citizenship and industrial democracy originated in Europe in the early 20th century, but they later extended to the developing world, along with industry, and they extended to both capitalist and socialist countries. Different in different cases. There was great variation in the way these institutions worked, and the way these ideas were even conceived in different countries. Now, since the 1980s, and especially since the 1990s, the ideas and the institutions of industrial democracy and industrial citizenship have been severely eroded with the rise of neoliberalism, which has greatly impacted how factories are organized and industrial relations in many different countries around the globe. My book is exclusively about China, about the changes in industrial relations over the last 70 years. And it's a great example or a case to look at this, the changes from the era of global or industrial citizenship to the new neoliberal era, because industrial relations have changed so dramatically in China. I compare two eras, the first of which could be called the work unit system from the 1950s through the 1980s, And then the second could be called, what they call it in China, the modern enterprise system from the 1990s to the present. These systems were divided, or the transition from one to the other took place through a process called industrial restructuring. Most of the research about this transition has been about the economic impact, especially the economic impact on workers with massive layoffs. More than 60 million people lost their jobs in just a few years. My research has not been about the economic impact so much as about the political impact. And by that, I mean the changing power relations between workers and managers inside of factories. With this book, I join a longstanding debate about the relationship among China scholars, but among scholars around the world. It's a debate about the relationship between job tenure, employee dependency, and workplace power. In his book, published in 1986, called Communist Neo-Traditionalism, Work and Authority in Chinese Industry, Andy Walder argued that permanent employment, as well as the workplace provision of welfare, led to dependency. Dependency on workers on the workplace, as well as dependency on their immediate supervisors. To break this dependency, he argued, it was necessary to end this tradition of permanent job tenure and have an open job market. Other scholars have challenged Walder's interpretation as one-sided. They have argued that secure job tenure in China actually enhanced workers' power in some ways. Among these scholars have been Qinhuang Li, Elizabeth Perry, John Unger, Anita Chan, and Huiyin Li. My book compares the two eras. I think most of these scholars they've looked back on the work unit era as kind of a background to set the context, and then they really focus mainly on the industrial restructuring and the new industrial relations that have been put in place since then. My book really goes back to the work unit era. It compares the two eras systematically before the industrial restructuring and after industrial restructuring. And so in that way, I'm really going back to the territory of Andrew Walder's book, where he was looking, written in 1986, where he was looking at the work unit era and how industrial relations functioned during that period. And then going forward into the present, the more industrial restructuring and the subsequent period, and comparing the two eras. But really, I focus on the work unit era again. I've got 6 chapters on that era, and I've only got 1 chapter on industrial restructuring and the new industrial relations in China. In this book, I introduce a conceptual framework to kind of frame this discussion. It involves 2 important factors, workplace citizenship and autonomy. By workplace citizenship, I mean it's really the equivalent to citizenship in a national state, but it's citizenship within the workplace, within the factory. And in this way, an enterprise really becomes a polity, becomes a political entity in itself. And the employees of the enterprise then become members of the enterprise, become citizens of the enterprise, and are considered legitimate stakeholders. So that's workplace citizenship. The second factor is autonomy. And by that, I mean the right to express opinions and organize collectively on the one hand, and also the right to manage your own affairs directly on the shop floor or wherever your work is. My premise is that workplace democracy requires both workplace citizenship and autonomy. I look at these as both continuous variables. They're not dichotomous variables. You either have them or you don't. There's a great degree of variation in all workplaces between high levels of citizenship and low levels of citizenship, and high levels of autonomy and low levels of autonomy. If you have a high level of workplace citizenship, that means that you're considered full members of the workplace and you have enforceable claims to your jobs. They can't just fire you at will, and you're considered legitimate stakeholders with a voice in the enterprise. If you have a low level of workplace citizenship, that means you can be hired and fired at will. You're just considered to be hired hands. In terms of autonomy, a high level of autonomy means that there's substantial room for collective action and for self-management. And a low level of autonomy means there's little room for either collective action or self-management. A combination of these two factors give rise to different kinds of what Michael Buravoy would call factory regimes. He's identified several. I identify them a little bit differently, but basically using his same model. If you have a combination of workplace citizenship, a low level of workplace citizenship, a low level of autonomy, an example might be a high turnover electronics factory. If you have a low level of workplace citizenship, but a high level of workplace autonomy, you end up with a situation that I call individual autonomy. An example might be engineers in a software development firm, where they actually have a great deal of autonomy to manage their own affairs, but they can't not organize collectively, as we've seen recently at Google. I mean, if you have a high level of workplace citizenship, but a low level of autonomy, you get a situation of paternalism. An example might be a company town. Everything is organized by the company. Everything is controlled by the company, but the workers have a fair degree of job security. If you have, and this is a very rare condition, a high level of workplace citizenship and a high level of autonomy, you get what might be called workplace democracy. One example might be a workers' collective, where everybody's a member of the collective, they make decisions collectively. There's very few firms like this in the world. There are some. Another example might be one that some of us are more familiar with in university situations where there's a strong system of tenure, where at least tenured faculty have a high degree of workplace citizenship. And we have in some universities, including Hopkins for the most part, we have more so in the past than the present, perhaps the future, but we have a fairly high degree of autonomy. Folks in individual departments collectively sit down and make decisions about curriculum and about all kinds of other issues which are very, very important to the faculty in the university. So there's at least some sense of workplace autonomy, workplace democracy in situations like a workers' collective or in a situation like a university where there's a high degree of tenure system is strong and departments actually make decisions. My research is exclusively about China. It's about radical changes in both of these factors over the last 70 years. My main sources have been interviews with workers and cadres in over 50 factories. And these have been extensive interviews over many years. I've been doing this research for the last 10 years and interviewed many of these workers over and over again as things have changed over the years. As well as newspapers, both official newspapers published by the government and by factories and by the Communist Party, and by the Cultural Revolution factions during the eras of upheaval in the 1960s. As well as publications published by the factories, gazetteers, which are the factory histories, official factory histories, and other documents. Today, I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of the central narrative of the book. I'll start in 1948. The book starts in 1948, when the Communist Party was beginning to take over Chinese cities and was beginning to take over Chinese factories. To do this, the Communist Party dispatched a few cadres to each factory, just a handful. That's all they had. Their numbers were not enough to send more than that. These cadres were peasant revolutionaries. Most of them grew up in the countryside. They hadn't been to cities. They knew very little about industry. They were excellent organizers, but they had very little connections in the city and knew very little about industry. They relied on the workers in factories in order to take control of the factories. And to do that, then they mobilized the workers against the capitalists and the old regime managers. Now, a good part of more than a third of industry in China at that point was owned by the government. This was the Kuomintang government. They did not trust the new communist victors in the Civil War, did not trust either the capitalists or the old regime managers from the Kuomintang government. And so they relied really almost exclusively on the workers to try to take over the factory. To do that, they built a factory party organization on the shop floor. They recruited workers to be party members. And they also built much larger organizations, the union, and then the staff and workers congresses. The union included all employees, virtually all employees. and the Staff and Workers Congresses were elected by the workers. They were nominally the leading organization in the factory, although that was nominal. And they promoted then workers, systematically promoted workers to leadership positions to take the place of the old managers and capitalists. By 1956, they had nationalized all of industry in China. All industry became public. It was either state-owned or collectively owned. And the Communist Party had established its complete control through factories, in all factories in China. During this period, they built the work unit system, which was then in place for decades, from the 1950s through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Workers became work unit members. Their status changed from hired hands to permanent employees. This was quite a tremendous change in their relationship with the factories. And under the system, there was extensive mobility within each unit. There was a lot of promotion to higher levels, especially during this early period. However, there was little mobility among units. This was based on permanent membership or permanent employment in an individual factory. It was very difficult to move between one enterprise or one work unit and another. This required that the worker himself had to want to move. He had to get the permission of the work unit, the leaders of his work unit, and also the leaders of the work unit that he wanted to move to. This just didn't happen that often. People, after they graduated from high school or college or elementary school, they were assigned to a work unit and they basically stayed there for their entire lives. The system was also based on a highly egalitarian, or relatively egalitarian system of distribution. That meant that in terms of everybody lived in the same apartment complexes, the cadres and the workers together for the most part, had more or less the same size of apartments, based largely on, this was during the Mao era, based largely on how many family members you had. And their kids went to the same childcare centers and schools. They rode the same bicycle paths to work. They used the same health clinics. And wages and pensions and other benefits were fairly egalitarian. Oftentimes, the highest paid employees in the factory were veteran workers and they were not the party secretary or the factory director or the chief engineer. They often received lower wages than the most veteran workers. The system also promoted the idea and institutions of democratic management. That's what they called it, Minju Wanli. This meant two things, I think, most importantly. This wasn't simply window dressing. This was very important, actually, aspects of the work unit system for the Communist Party for their own purposes. The first was that they really wanted workers to take responsibility for their own management on the shop floor. They wanted them to manage their own affairs. To do this, they organized everybody into small groups. The members of the small groups, really, they met every day before work and after work to manage their own affairs. They criticized their own members when they weren't working hard enough. They all took responsibility for different aspects of the work. They often elected their own small team leaders. And they were largely responsible for managing their own work on the shop floor. That was on the shop floor. They had very little influence. The self-management on the shop floor did not mean that they had a lot of influence at the higher levels, at the factory level, or certainly not at the municipal level or the ministry level that ran the factories. And this was a centralized planning, so a lot of the decisions were made at these higher levels. The second, I think, main element of what the Communist Party called democratic management was what they called mass supervision, or Chunzhong Jiandu, which meant mass supervision over the factory cadres. The purpose of this was that the Communist Party was very concerned about controlling its own local cadres. It was concerned about corruption. It was concerned about abuse of power, about alienation of these cadres from the workers, about what they called commandism, not listening to those from below you, about straying from party policies. They wanted all of its cadres to follow very closely the party policies. And so it was concerned about controlling its own cadres. It had a tremendous amount of control from above. This was a highly centralized party. It was a highly disciplined party. It was able to control its own cadres through the party and administer bureaucracies, but it never believed that this was enough. And from the time even before it took over China's cities and when it was ensconced in the countryside and villages and these base areas, it implemented different campaigns of mass supervision. And the purpose of these was to make the leaders accountable to their subordinates. And then the party itself would mobilize the subordinates to criticize party leaders and to hold them accountable for their actions and behaviors and positions. Now, the main, I guess, themes that I develop in the book is that the whole work unit system during this whole period was based on strong workplace citizenship, but very weak autonomy. Strong citizenship because workers had permanent job tenure and they were considered legitimate stakeholders. But very weak autonomy because the Communist Party tightly controlled all factory organizations and stifled union leaders' efforts to gain more autonomy. And they organized these staff and workers congresses, but they held a tight rein on these congresses, so they really had to follow the party's leadership. There were a couple times in the 1950s in which union leaders, the top leaders of the union, wanted to get more autonomy from the party. They said that we need to have this in order to actually represent the workers. And they were defeated and removed from positions of power for doing that. So the party wanted to maintain very tight control over the union and very tight control over the staff and workers congresses, and they suppressed all potential opposition. Weak autonomy was actually a problem for the Communist Party leadership itself. The problem is, how could workers supervise factory leaders from whom they lacked autonomy? They were expected to supervise these leaders, what they called supervise. This isn't supervising the English meaning, the typical English meaning of the term, jiandu. It means supervise from below or render them responsible to folks below. But how could they do this if they lacked autonomy from these very same leaders? The way that the Communist Party dealt with this typically was by organizing mass movements of mass supervision. These were all initiated by Mao Zedong. This was his particular role in the party to organize these movements. And they organized they organized them all the time. But the biggest ones during the Mao era were the 3 antis and 5 antis movements in the early 1950s, the party rectification campaign in the late 1950s, the Four Queens campaign in the early 1960s, and then finally culminating in the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s. Before 1956, lack of autonomy was not that much of a problem. At least the Communist Party did not consider it a big problem because they were concerned mainly with mobilizing workers against the old factory leaders. And this is what mass supervision was all about, controlling and supervising the old leaders, the capitalists and the old management inherited from the old regime. They figured they could do this by sending in teams of party leaders to mobilize campaigns against the old leaders. They also had campaigns against the new cadres, the new communist cadres that were in factories, but they figured the main problem with these folks is that they were being corrupted by the old leaders. So this was true in the early campaigns in the 1950s. After 1956, the situation changed dramatically. Now the Communist Party controlled all of the factories. The old leaders had been removed from positions of power, and now lack of autonomy became a much more pressing problem. Now it was a matter of workers exercising some kind of mass supervision over the communist cadres who now ran the factories. So the subsequent campaigns I see as various types of experiments to try to introduce some kind of autonomy into mass supervision. These included the main campaigns during this period were the Party Rectification Campaign, which began immediately after 1956, and then the Four Cleans Campaign, and finally the Cultural Revolution. I'll go over each one of these briefly in this presentation. The Party Rectification Campaign in 1957. During that campaign, Mao Zedong encouraged freewheeling criticism of communist cadres from below, from the folks below them, from the folks that they were in charge of leading. Now, the campaign mainly took place among intellectuals in schools and offices. And most of the literature about it has been about intellectuals in schools and offices, and that's for good reason, because that's where the campaign was really centered. But it also took place in factories. Union leaders pressed, this was one of the times when union leaders pressed for more autonomy for the union, as well as more autonomy. They really pushed the Staff and Workers Congress during this period during this campaign, building up to this campaign, and then during this campaign itself. And workers took it upon themselves to organize protests and strikes. This was the biggest strike wave in China since 1949. But the experiment was quickly aborted. It only lasted about 6 weeks of intense activity, and then it was aborted due to tremendous opposition within the party. And it turned around in a week. The party rectification campaign became the anti-rightist campaign, where they punished the folks who had raised criticisms. And so this was a tremendous blow to the whole project of mass supervision, because they had punished the folks who had actually raised the criticisms that they were asking them to raise, calling upon them to raise. The next campaign was the Four Cleans campaign. Started slowly in 1962 and extended until the Cultural Revolution in 1966. It was initially started in villages, but it also took place in factories. In fact, it took place widely in factories, much more widely in factories. Virtually every factory that I investigated, as well as virtually every factory that I was hundreds of factories were able to gather gazetteers. And it was part of the histories in all of those factories that had been built before, that had been started before 1964. In this campaign, Mao went back to the conventional system. Factory leaders were set aside. The local factory leaders, the new work team took control of the factory. Activist workers were asked to join the Four Cleans committees, and then all workers were mobilized to criticize the factory leaders. And they organized factory elections, where they were supposed to elect not only their small team leaders, but workshop leaders, as well as the factory leaders. These were experimental elections. They never really were fully institutionalized. A problem with this whole campaign was that the workers participated under work team leadership. And what this did is it simply reinforced top-down authority. There simply was not much autonomy in this campaign. Workers were expected to criticize the leaders of the workplaces, but only really under the tutelage of the work teams. This was a tightly controlled campaign, but that did not mean that it was not a fearsome campaign when it came to criticizing cadres. A small group leader in an electronics plant told me everyone had to speak up. It was not spontaneous. It was carried out the way movements were supposed to be, following the regular conventions. It was very serious. Everyone was very tense, cadres and workers too. It was very fierce, very terrifying. It cleaned up the cadres' problems. I think the Work Cleans movement was the healthiest movement. Somebody from a little bit different point of view, an ordinary cadre in a steel mill, told me the leaders went through a very difficult time. They had to account for their problems over and over again. All the mid-level cadres also had to, quote, shower and steep for 3 days or a week. They had to confess and write self-criticism essays. It was very undemocratic, very cruel. Everyone was fearful. Everyone was worried. What have I done wrong? You can see that they have different perspectives on this campaign, but they're describing very much the same situation. Mao was not happy with the campaign. It's clear that from both the research I did as well as research that other scholars have done, that this campaign was very effective in curbing cadre corruption. But it was less effective in curbing cadres, what the Communist Party called bureaucratic tendencies. By these, they meant isolation. This is what they called them. This is bureaucratic tendencies: isolation from the masses, commandism, controlling, restricting, and repressing the workers. Mao was not at all satisfied with the campaign. He said in 1965, in the midst of the campaign, at the height of the campaign, he said, when you develop a mass movement in the midst of the struggle, the masses are going to do what they want to do. And they'll create their own leaders. In short, you have to rely on the masses. You can't rely on the work teams. The work teams don't understand the situation, or in ignorance, they become bureaucrats and obstruct. It was clear that by 1965, Mao had an increasingly jaundiced view of his own party officials. He said in 1965, this once again at the height of the campaign, the class of bureaucrats is sharply opposed to the working class and the poor and lower middle peasants. These leaders who take the capitalist road have become or are becoming capitalists who suck the workers' blood. How can they sufficiently understand the necessity of the socialist revolution? They are the targets of the revolution. This is his own party officials he's talking about. In 1966, therefore, he experimented with a much more radical method of mass supervision. This was the Cultural Revolution. He fomented what he called a rebel movement, Disenfranchised. He called on students and workers in every school and every workplace to form rebel groups. And these groups were to be autonomous from the party organization. His main slogan at that point was bombard the headquarters. And by that he meant the headquarters of the Communist Party. Workers divided in every school and every workplace. Well, in every workplace, workers divided into rebel and conservative camps, with rebels attacking the factory party organization and conservatives defending. In my estimation, the rebels were very effective agents of mass supervision. This was because they were self-organized, the leaders nominated themselves, and they recruited their own followers. This was not tutelaged by the Communist Party in any way. They only listened to Mao. They fought against the local Communist Party organization. They organized initially small fighting groups, and these eventually formed big coalitions. These were led by workers. Now, some of these leaders of these rebel coalitions were rank and file party members, but often ones that were not very happy with the leadership in their own organizations. But many of them were workers that had never joined the Communist Party, either because they never had the opportunity to, or they were discriminated against, or because they never had been defined, because it was such an organization that demanded such tight control. In my estimation, the rebel movement was never inspired by a particular political program. What they didn't like, what united them, was they didn't like the party's tight control, and they celebrated what they called rebel spirit. They were quite fond of Mao's main slogan during this period, which he called Big Democracy, Da Minju. And this became the main slogan of the rebels. A shift leader in an electronics plant said, "Before you didn't dare speak because of the cadres, but now you could speak the truth. You didn't have to be concerned about what the leaders thought. They were all capitalist voters. Their power was gone." A railroad worker told me, when we called the meetings, the leaders didn't dare talk. They were the targets. But the conservatives insisted that the Communist Party had not made any mistakes. It was a debate among the masses. We debated all the time, when we were working, when we ate, after work. Now, this was a movement that was not spontaneous. These rebels all responded to Mao's call. That's the only way they existed. And although they challenged party authorities, they had to be loyal to Mao. They had to be loyal to Mao because they would not have existed without the Mao's authority. They depended completely on Mao's authority for their own power. And they had to therefore adhere to Mao's directives. For instance, when workers raised economic demands, Mao was very upset with this. He called it economism. He wanted them to focus on challenging the party leadership for bureaucratism. He did not want them raising economic demands. And so the rebels dutifully wrote big character posters condemning economism. There's a photograph of them making one of these posters. This movement has been rightly called a movement of the top and the bottom versus the middle. That is, Mao at the top and workers and students and peasants at the bottom versus the Communist Party local cadres in the middle, the organization of the party in the middle. In January of 1967, Mao made a quite astounding call. He called for the rebels to seize power. This changed the direction of the movement. After this, factory party organizations were paralyzed. They were largely paralyzed before this, but this completely, they stopped meeting whatsoever altogether. And factories fell into the hands of contending factions. All of them wanted to seize power. The whole movement became much more complicated and increasingly violent. Factional conflict between these various factions for control over factories, for control over schools, for control over local governments. In the book, I do case studies in a chapter on this period, case studies of 3 cities, Zhengzhou and Luoyang in Henan province and Wuhan in Hubei province. I'm not going to go into the details comparing these 3 cities in this talk. I simply don't have time to. I'll just discuss some of the common points. The truth is that Mao never really intended for the rebels to take power. He looked at them as temporary agents of mass supervision. He wanted something more radical where the workers would actually be able to hold the leaders to account. He called on them to seize power for this purpose. but he never really intended for this new rebel organizations to become a new communist party that would take over the country or take over local institutions. Instead, he called for the formation of new revolutionary committees. These involved three different groups. One, he sent in military officers to every factory, to every school, to every government, local government, and these military officers were supposed to arbitrate between the factions in order to create these revolutionary committees, decide who was going to serve on them. It also was composed of veteran cadres. These were old cadres, old Communist Party cadres, veterans of the revolution who were typically in charge before the Cultural Revolution. Now the masses were supposed to consider which among these cadres were worthwhile bringing back into leadership. The third group, of course, was then mass representatives, the leaders of the rebel factions. What this led to, this was a very violent process. Hundreds of thousands of people were, not during this period, but there were lots and lots of people that were victimized and killed in these battles between factions, as well as in the suppression of these factions then. Ultimately, in 1968 and 1969, it led to a period of military rule between 1969 and 1972. This was a very repressive period. When the military officers actually took control of these revolutionary committees, they suppressed not only the rebels, but they also marginalized the old cadres. Finally, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai succeeded in removing the military from the factories in 1972. This led to an unprecedented period of institutionalized factional contention inside factories within the party between 1973 and 1976. In every factory, power was divided, or virtually every factory, with veteran cadres in charge, actually in the old positions, actually running the factory, and former rebel leaders having gained positions to, quote, supervise the veteran cadres. Those positions perhaps in the union, perhaps in propaganda organizations, perhaps in the militia, the factory militias, or in other positions where they could criticize and organize movements against the factory leaders. So this was a period in which factories were divided, the entire country, from the village and the factory all the way up to Zhongnanhai in Beijing, the leadership of the Communist Party. They were divided, the party was divided between radical and conservative factions. They had distinct political programs. Now these became definite political programs, a radical program versus a conservative program, including programs in industrial policies. They were led at the top by the more conservative leaders of the party, veteran leaders of the party, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and others, versus the Gang of Four, of course, these leaders that Mao promoted to lead the Cultural Revolution. And these factions extended down to the factory floor, to every level of the factories as well. And it was known then, what they called it then, both among popular expression and in newspapers, etc., they called it the old cadres versus the new cadres. It was also a period of alternating political winds, with Mao modulating which direction these winds were going. He first supported the radicals, and then he would support the conservatives, coming back against the radical to kind of attenuate the radical movements. So radical movement was the criticized Lin Biao and Confucius movement, 1973 to 1974. Then Deng Xiaoping was authorized to come back with a rectification campaign in 1975. And then the radicals again were organized the workers again in a campaign against Deng Xiaoping and his rectification campaign, which they called Beat Back the Right Deviationist Wind, which eventually led to the fall of Deng Xiaoping in 1976. It led to competing mass rallies in cities across China, with the radicals organizing some and the conservatives or the moderates organizing others. The biggest one, the most famous one, of course, was the rally at Tiananmen Square to mourn Zhou Enlai's death. The rally took place in Qingming on April 5th, 1976. This whole period came to an end with Mao's death in September 1976. And after that, there was just a systematic purge of the radicals. The radicals completely depended on Mao. And after he died, they absolutely could not continue to survive, and they were purged from the party. I look at the Cultural Revolution as a failed experiment in autonomous mass supervision. During the rebel movement, during the early period, The rebels became effective agents of mass supervision. They were able to challenge factory party leaders, and they permanently undermined their authority. This wasn't just at the moment, this was forever. The authority of party leaders was never the same. They could do this because they were autonomous from the party organization, but their autonomy was limited by their dependence on Mao. And most importantly, they were only allowed a momentary existence. The second period of the Cultural Revolution, this period of institutionalized factional contention between 73 and 76, was really unprecedented. They never had this kind of organized factional contention within the party open. They all had newspaper articles and journal articles and organizations, not open organizations, but actually de facto organizations at every level. But of course, the autonomy of any of these factions was sharply limited because it all took place within the Communist Party. And the entire experiment ended with the purge of the radical faction. What took place after that was that Deng Xiaoping and the old party leadership came back to power. And they restored the old monocratic party system. No more factional contention. They enhanced, but at the same time that they eliminated these factions, they purged completely the radical faction. They enhanced the formal mechanisms of worker participation. They also introduced cautious market reforms. These were cautious during the 1980s, and they did not actually attack the fundamental features of the work unit system, which remained in place. These were public property, factories remained public property, workers continued to have permanent job tenure, and workers, because of this, inside factories, workers retained substantial influence. This was workers that I talked to about this period. They all think about it as, not all of them, but many of them think about it as the golden age of the Staff and Workers Congress system. The Staff and Workers Congress always had an unstable history. The entire Mao era, it went up and down, sometimes greatly, a great deal of power, other times no power at all. Sometimes meeting, sometimes not meeting. It was revived after 1978 by Deng Xiaoping, and it was given substantial formal powers, more so than it had in the past. And there were new experiments with factory elections. This time, once again, even factory directors were elected in many factories, not the party secretaries, but the factory directors were elected. The Staff and Workers Congress were very active in the 1980s, but they were always, this was a monolithic system now again, and they were always under party tutelage. Nevertheless, they became important vehicles for workers' influence. It became clear in interviewing folks who worked in factories in that period and participated in this institution. They had long meetings which deliberated particularly over welfare provision now. This was very different than in the past. Particularly questions of housing, questions of working conditions, etc., became deliberated at these meetings, and they had a great deal of influence. But they were weakened by enterprise reform in the late 1980s. This was when the Communist Party started stressing the factory director has to be in charge of the enterprise, and they wanted to diminish the role of all of the organizations under the party itself, including the union and the Staff and Workers Congress, and they also began hiring new workers on a contract basis rather than permanent job tenure. But the real blow came after 1992, after Deng took his famous Southern tour of factories in Shenzhen, foreign invested factories in Shenzhen and other cities. This led to the company law in 1994, two main laws, the company law and the new labor law. In 1994, the company law set up the modern enterprise system. It privatized or restructured all factories. Some were completely privatized. Most of them, this means selling them to their managers or maybe to the outside investors. Even the ones that remained state-owned were restructured so they would maximize profits and minimize labor costs. It set up 3 new committees to replace the 3 old committees. The 3 old committees were the Communist Party Committee, the Union, and the Staff and Workers Congress. The 3 new committees now were the Board of Directors, the Board of Supervisors, and the Shareholders Meeting. So you can see how very, very different structure of power in factories. These didn't always initially have a great deal of power, but they slowly became very, very important organizations. The labor law in 1995 opened the way for massive layoffs. This was fundamentally reduced work unit members from members of the work unit, permanent employees to contract employees. That led to hundreds of factories, lots and lots of factories, thousands of factories closing, many millions of workers, tens of millions of workers being laid off. In this entire process, the Staff and Workers Congress became venues for industrial restructuring, for these battles over industrial restructuring. Although they became much weaker than they were already in the 1980s, they nevertheless had to sign off on employee reallocation plans, which really meant layoff plans. And so there were vociferous debates about how to do this. There were huge street protests at the time. I did, in the book, I do a chapter, which is a case study of what happened at the Brilliant Glass Company during this time. I don't have time now to go into the details, but once again, you can ask questions. And please type up your questions anytime. I'll see them after I get to the questions at the end of this presentation very soon. Resistance continues to this day. Here's a protest, the photograph is a protest of steelworkers who are going to be laid off in 2016. This resistance has led to a lot of temporary and partial victories, but overall it simply could not, the workers simply could not stop this restructuring juggernaut, which has really fundamentally restructured the way industrial relations are organized in China. As I said, tens of millions have been laid off. There's now a new system of employment, a tiered employment system in factories. I'm talking about the old state-owned factories that were now been privatized or restructured. In almost every factory, you see this structure now with a shrinking core of veteran workers who are waiting to retire, and then a growing periphery of precarious workers that simply come and go. A very, very different system of employment than in the past. And there's vast inequality now between owners or the leaders of the factory and the workers, both in terms of wages. Wages, before I said, were relatively equal. Now can be hundreds and hundreds of times difference between the leaders of the factory's wages and their pensions and benefits and those of the workers. Factory conditions have changed a lot. There's now much longer hours. Many people work 7 days a week, maybe 10 or 12 hours a day, and much more intense labor while they're at work. There's also much more coercive industrial relations. The small teams no longer meet, typically. They are still organized in small teams often, but they never meet. And discipline is enforced instead by fines and threats of discharge. In many factories, there have been worse state-owned factories. The Staff and Workers Congress continues to meet, but it's in steep decline. If they meet at all, they have irregular, short, formalistic meetings. And in many, many factories, there's simply the Staff and Workers Congress no longer meets at all. It exists still on paper, but it no longer actually meets. I think the changes in factories were summed up by two employees of the former employees of the glass factory in one case, where I did the case study. A veteran worker, he'd been working there for 27 years. He now worked in a privatized part of the factory, fiberglass reinforced plastics plant. He said, he told me, "Today, who dares say anything? The factory is private. If the boss wants to employ you, he'll keep you. If not, he'll get rid of you. Back then, you could raise issues. To be blunt, now they don't let you speak, they only let you work. Before, there was some room to discuss things. Since enterprise restructuring, now you just work, that's it." Same factory, the deputy director, who was also the union chair and the second largest shareholder, shows how much the union has changed. He told me, "Ordinary workers don't understand anything about the enterprise, especially the contract workers. Their brains don't think about much, they just work and get paid. That's it. Ordinary workers can't express themselves well, they're different from us. We see things from a different perspective, we know the situation better." Once again, you can see two very different perspectives, but describing the same situation. So summing up the book, the work unit system, in my estimation, was never particularly democratic. Workers enjoyed strong workplace citizenship. They were members of the workplace, members of the work unit, and they were considered legitimate stakeholders, and they had substantial influence, particularly on the shop floor. However, the system was always featured weak autonomy, very weak autonomy. The union and the Staff and Workers Congress were under party tutelage. And the experiments that took place, and these were important experiments, very interesting experiments, but they all failed. They all were aborted ultimately. And without autonomy, it was impossible to develop a democracy. Since then, since industrial restructuring, industrial citizenship has been revoked. This whole process, it's still an ongoing process, a very, very difficult process. It reduced work unit members to hired hands. It diminished their dependency, just as Andrew Walder predicted or suggested. But at the same time, because now they can change jobs, they can move to another job if they're not happy, if they can find one. But at the same time, it severely eroded workers' power inside the factory. In terms of the prospects, it's really hard to tell what's going to happen in the future, of course. There's very large numbers of strikes and protests among workers in China today. Less so these years than in the high point of these strikes between like 2008 and 2015, 16. But they continue still in high numbers, and workers may regain, through these kind of resistance, they may regain a degree of job security. But until they do, they'll be in a weak position to demand more say in factory affairs. So that's my presentation. I look forward now to your questions. Okay, the first question is that the movements, this is from who? I'm not sure who it's from. It says the movements discussed today were aimed at strengthening Mao's control over factories. What strategies did Mao use to control other sectors of the economy like universities and hospitals? Mao's individual control, this is the difference. Before, Mao was the most powerful individual in China, but he ruled through the Communist Party largely. What the Cultural Revolution was about was actually Mao attempting to impose his policies on the Communist Party by mobilizing the masses of workers as well as peasants and students. What I've discussed is mainly in factories, but it also took place in schools. Of course, it started in schools, the Cultural Revolution. In the countryside, it was much more attenuated, and there hasn't been a lot of research done. There are some village studies which give you a taste of what was happening in villages, but I think there really needs to be much more substantial research about what was actually happening in villages. And I think there was less room for the rebel leaders. Most of them came from high schools in the county towns that went back to their villages and tried to organize some kind of rebel movement. But in terms of what happened in schools, it was very different in schools because the students were graduated early actually and sent away. Many of them sent to work in the countryside or work in factories. And so the rebel movement just disappeared. There were some rebels among the faculty, among the staff at the university, but those organizations, of course, the organizations were all dismantled like they all were, but they simply didn't have the real, they didn't exist in the same sense after the students left. In factories, what was different was that the rebel movement, the workers all stayed put. And the rebels were still there. They were still organized at this point in a de facto instead of having actual de jure organizations. But they were still there and they still acted as a force of power within the factories, many of them, where they weren't suppressed too strongly. And they continued then through the 70s. I think Mao was a person of movements. Not a person really of administration or managing. His role in the division of labor was always to set a vision and then organize the change. He was always wanting to move forward to his particular vision of what socialism and what communism should look like. He was a man who was most interested in movements and change and not that interested in managing things. One example was that he set up these revolutionary committees. He allowed them then to be taken over by the military in order to really suppress this violent factional conflict. And then he never paid much attention to those revolutionary committees after that. He mobilized these movements. He allowed these radicals to mobilize these movements after that, but they never really developed into any kind of institutional framework that really worked as an autonomous framework within factories. Okay, let's see. I've got other questions here. John asks, were military officers trusted by the party, I guess, before they were sent in to help with the revolutionary committees. The military was its own organization. And I think that people revered the military in some sense. The Communist Party, its propaganda was all about how the military were liberated China. I don't think people worked directly under the military. And the military, of course, was a much more militarized hierarchy than the civilian institutions in China. I think that people revered the military, but were not used to working under that kind of hierarchy that the military attempted to impose on factories after the revolutionary committees were established. Of course, they didn't listen to these military officers at first. The rebels didn't listen to them. They didn't have to listen to them until they were really suppressed as rebel movements. And then they had to listen to them, and they were not at all happy under military rule. I've got to go over these quickly. Let's see, we've got 3 minutes left. Hannah asks, in discussing the rebel movement in the 1960s, you brought up big democracy. Could I expand on that? In what ways did it nurture or hinder the work of the rebels? Big democracy was actually brought up originally in 1957, or 1956, actually, when Mao was first conceiving this party rectification campaign, which was also called the 100 Flowers movement. And he thought that big democracy, what it meant to him was really battles in the streets in some sense, not institutionalized democracy, but movements in the streets, strikes and protests and rebellions and revolutions and violent street protests. All of this was big democracy for him. And he thought that this was the way that the masses really made themselves felt in society, their demands felt. And so he pushed it. He said in 1957, though, the Communist Party officials are starting to act like bureaucrats, but and if they continue to act like bureaucrats, we're going to see of our will, whether we will it or not, there's going to be big democracy in China. There's going to be riots and revolutions and protests. But at this point in 1957, we should have small democracy. We should have just exercises in criticism of these leaders inside institutions. By 1966, he had decided it was time for big democracy. And I think the rebels really seized on this idea. They all celebrated it. That's what they were all about. It gave them a lot of power, but only briefly, as I mentioned. Let's see what other questions we have. I think we have time for maybe one more question. We're going over a little bit here, actually. It would seem like the party was able to put the proverbial genie back in the bottle after Mao's dalliance with the rebels. Do you see other groups, such as the Khmer Rouge, having been inspired by this? That's a question inspired by, this is a question from Brian. I'd ask Brian if he was here, if we could actually communicate. Inspired by the Cultural Revolution Rebellion or inspired by the suppression of the rebels? I'm not sure. I don't know a lot about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I would say the party, the Communist Party, putting the genie back in the bottle was a very, very difficult process in China. And nobody would want to repeat that process the way that it actually took place in China. Mao thought that the rebels, in some ways, I'm sure he was not completely dissatisfied. He was largely dissatisfied with the Cultural Revolution. He thought that it largely failed in his final years. That's what he said. I think that he thought that it did have some influence on cadres' behavior, and it did. This was some kind of mass supervision by a powerful movement. But putting the genie back in the bottle was an extremely violent process that cost an awful lot of people their lives and was an extremely repressive process. I'm sure that it was very disturbing to him because these were the people that rose up against, followed his call to rebel. And now, in order to curb the violent factional contention, he was having to allow the military to suppress them. I'm sure the whole process was very disturbing to him. It's disturbing to people who lived through this process on whatever side they were on. It was also a period when they were also suppressing the local cadres. So I'm not sure that in terms of its influence around the world, I'm not sure how much people understood it at the time in other countries, what was really going on, and that includes in Cambodia. Of course, the Khmer Rouge were a military organization that took over the country and was much more expected to resolve political problems in a much more violent military fashion than the Communist Party in 1966. More like the Communist Party in 1949, of course, 48, 49, but at that point, the Communist Party very definitely repressed and suppressed and killed a lot of its opponents. But it decided to shift to civilian rule, and it decided to bring the vast majority of the population into this rule. It was very deliberate about that. So it was, I think, very different than what Khmer Rouge ended up doing in Cambodia. I think that's it. I think that's all we have time for at this point, unfortunately. I'm sorry I went on too long, but thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. And I hope to see other more interesting programs on this Homewood at Home. Thank you very much.